it is to herd cats, it's much more difficult to herd advocates. And all of the conversations in the margins, of course, are very important in these situations. But in any event, welcome back, both to you here and to those online. I've been informed that we have a hard stop at noon because there's a class that will want to be here starting class then. So we'll move expeditiously. I want to say a couple general things at the beginning. The first is that this is a topic that should unite us, right? There are so many things in the world right now that don't do that. But the environment should unite us. It's the basis of our society, of our civilization, of our health, and human rights and environment is equally the same kind of issue. The second, I just wanted personally to acknowledge the leadership of John Knox, David Boyd, Mark Lehman, and Su-Young Huang. There are many, many other people who have been leading this fight. As you heard, the outpouring of support for the resolution in the Human Rights Council was truly extraordinary. 100,000 children, or 1 million maybe, 1,500 NGOs, 15 parts of the UN, the different agencies, including UNDP and the World Health Organization, the General Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, the American Bar Association. 400,000 lawyers in this country has endorsed the right to a healthy environment. I could just keep going on. Businesses, it's truly, it's not just extraordinary, it's unprecedented. And this is a way to bring us together. And there have been a lot of leaders in that process. Kristen is here with the children, et cetera. So the first panel and the opening speakers established a couple of things that are real important. First, there's no procedural impediment to going ahead with the General Assembly resolution. It's mentioned in the Human Rights Council's resolution that it should go to the General Assembly, or the General Assembly is invited, and it's a perfectly appropriate kind of topic. And as John Knox demonstrated, it meets all of the General Assembly's own criteria for consideration. The second is that we know what the basis for the right to a healthy environment is. In a way, it's empirical. As you may not know or may know, John Knox did a mapping exercise of all the different components of the human rights system and found a remarkable consistency among these different regional organizations, the treaties, national jurisprudence, on and on. So we know this relationship exists between human rights and environment, and we know that the right to a healthy environment has a very, very strong basis in terms of human rights. In terms of environment, we now understand the importance of ecosystem services. We know that nature, in fact, is the infrastructure of our society, that we need a healthy nature in order to continue our civilization, our societies, and not just our individual healths, and that our survival is at stake, as the initial speakers pointed out, with respect to climate change, biodiversity loss, toxification of the planet, and the water crisis. So we're ready to talk about how to actualize, how to implement this right. And we have 3 terrific speakers. I'm going to be very brief. Cesar is a professor here at NYU and leads efforts on justice and also on litigation. Maria is with the International Franciscans here in UN and in New York at the UN. And Samia is a law student, so we'll hear a little bit from, or not a little bit, we'll hear from youth, which is also good. She's at St. John's Law School. So let me turn it over. Each panelist will speak for 5 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions the same way that Mark did, although I need Mark up here to help me field those questions, so I hope you'll come back. So Cesar, may I start with you?
Thanks, Dan, and welcome everyone again. I guess we're here playing the role of hosts, and of course, in terms of just the facilities, because the real hosts are the ones who have been working on this effort for many, many years. But it does feel like a historical moment to us here at NYU Law, and we're happy to have you all here. The first time that I ever participated in a conversation on the international right to a healthy environment was in a meeting put together by John in Panama City. I don't know, John, if you remember that one, next to the Panama Canal, with indigenous leaders and socio-environmental activists from throughout Latin America. And it's incredible how far this effort has gone. That must have been around 8 years ago. And one of the leaders who attended that meeting, a fantastic indigenous female leader from the northern mountains of Colombia, Ana Maria Ochoa, who's now a judge in the Colombia Special Tribunal for Peace. I used to work with her people, the Cancuamo people in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia. And whenever we would litigate or do any case or research on the right to free prior informed consultation with Cancuamo people, she would come up to us and say, look, this is really not about FPIC, the free prior informed consultation technicalities. It really is about life. It is about protecting life on the planet, on this ecosystem. And that kind of stayed with me as we get more granular on the details of the technicalities, because in the end, that's what it is about. And what I want to share with you is today is, well, first of all, I had to talk about the normative cascade because Mark gave me no option. I mean, he put it in the title, so I had to rewrite the whole thing to speak about normative cascade, and then John added to the pressure. So I decided I had to say something about the normative cascade, which, by the way, is a term that's commonly used in international relations, international law, to describe a normative development in which one actor after another, one state after another, one civil society organization after another, get on board with an idea whose time has come, as John wrote in that compilation that he did with Ramin Pagin. And I do think that we're before a cascade that has gone a lot farther than many other normative cascades. In many other cascades of this type, the moment of international agreement has come much earlier. So think about indigenous people's rights, the ILO Convention 169, or the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Think of business and human rights with the UN guiding principles. At the moment in which those international instruments were adopted, we didn't have the 50 years of standard setting, of jurisprudence, of international campaigns. So this really feels overdue, as John and David explained. And I want to synthesize the two ideas that I want to share with you in two words: scale and speed. Because what normative cascades allow is to gain momentum. So the metaphor does matter here. Imagine a river that it's fed by streams, right? So the cascade needs to take momentum. And one of the challenges that we face in the environmental justice, environmental law, and human rights world is that the speed and the scale of international law, of standards in general, are much, much lower than the speed and the scale that are needed to confront the challenges of climate, biodiversity, and pollution, of other environmental crises. So the argument that I make is that the international recognition to the right, international recognition of the right to a healthy environment would considerably increase the speed and the scale of solutions to those challenges in ways that will considerably also help propel forward that cascade. So on scale, as has already been said, there are basically three streams that have fed into the normative cascade or the right to a healthy environment. One is constitutions and domestic law. Another one is regional treaties. and then global standards and fantastic instruments we have now, like the framework principles of the UN Rapporteurship on human rights and the environment. Interestingly, this particular normative cascade has proceeded from the bottom up, right? From the domestic to the international. So the fact that 150 plus states already have some recognition of the state shows how it really, the hopeful potential recognition of the right to a healthy environment at the General Assembly would be a catching up exercise, would be registering the consensus around the world. And by catching up, it would decisively push it forward. It would be kind of a double movement in just one decision. As it stands, that river is dammed by the lack of that international recognition at that level. And with three challenges that are associated with that stagnation. One is that as much as there is creativity and activity at the domestic level, well, one persistent challenge for the right to a healthy environment or any human right that stays at the level of domestic law is fragmentation. So there are fantastic efforts happening in the inter-American system, the African system, elsewhere, but there isn't kind of a focal point that everyone can use as a lingua franca to push forward and understand each other. So fragmentation is a cost of the existing situation. Another one is uncertainty, because different actors understand the content of the right differently. And finally, and more importantly, from my point of view, is inefficiency. There are so many missed opportunities for cross-learning and from cross-collaboration by not having an international recognition of the right to a healthy environment. And finally, speed. What I would see the right to a healthy environment doing in terms of addressing the speed gap is providing a catalyst for the solution to the three challenges that I just mentioned. So another way to look at the contribution of right to a healthy environment is as flip sides of those three challenges. So the right to a healthy environment would provide a focal point. And it would provide a form of harmonization among understandings by courts, activists, civil society actors that are currently working in the same direction, pushing in the same direction, but do not have yet kind of an international authoritative pronouncement that they can rely on. Second, of course, the right to a healthy environment would add precision and predictability. That was already mentioned. And again, this is a situation in which much of the work has already been done. So the framework principles that John's mandate produced is very much what you would expect to have if there weren't framework principles, we need to produce them, right? But they're already out there, right? So we need to have kind of the seal of approval of a general recognition and then move forward with implementation. And finally, cross-learning. Many governmental and non-governmental actors are already quite busy implementing the right to a healthy environment. David mentioned civil society organizations, litigators, but also there are judges working, cross-referencing each other through learning from each other through the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment. There are governments sharing best practices, and I know there's the possibility of creating a handbook on the right to a healthy environment that would further increase that cross-learning. Business, I was glad to hear that business is also quite interested, enthusiastic about this idea, and academia. This venue also represents a potential for cross-learning because many academic organizations are busy analyzing jurisprudence, comparing notes, cross-fertilizing ideas across jurisdictions, but all of that would gain much greater momentum if we did have the recognition at the level of the General Assembly. Thanks.
Thank you very much for putting this all in context, Cesar. I would point out that the normative cascade terminology reminds me of trophic cascade, which is a biologic term, which you're probably familiar with. That's the idea that the top of a food chain, if it is affected, will then there'll be effects all the way down the food chain in ways, of course, that are somewhat unpredictable by humans. And that notion, by the way, was developed out near where David Boyd lives. It was a person who went around to tidal basins and threw out all of the starfish and then watched what happened in the tidal basin. So the point here is that the right to a healthy environment, in a way I view it anyway, as being an overarching right. It's more than just the sum of the right to health, the right to life, the right to culture, the right to property, et cetera. It adds, and as we recognize it, as we implement it, it will affect in a very positive way, I think, the implementation of these other rights. So in that sense, it's similar to a trophic cascade. Maria, would you like to guide us through your talk?
Thank you to the organizers of the event. Franciscans International greatly appreciates the opportunity to participate and intervene. To begin, I would like to acknowledge and underscore that the recognition of the right to a healthy environment has been a longstanding demand by civil society, and I'd like to recognize that many activists and organizations have been working on the issue for decades, which we as FI have joined on to. In doing so, FI is echoing the concrete concerns of Franciscans and other partners globally, who both are from and work in local communities that experience the effects of environmental degradation. This includes indigenous communities in the Americas who bear the impacts of extractive activities, which are often undertaken without the consent of the local population, to communities in the Asia Pacific region, which face ever-rising sea levels. Environmental crises may manifest differently, but the message from partners is similar. States need to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and take other meaningful actions to address the triple planetary crisis. The universality and urgency of this is also reflected in the broad support of over 1,300 CSOs in the global call, which was mentioned earlier. This call reflected a diverse range of local, national, and international CSOs with varying mandates, and again, with wide support by youth activists. The urgency was also reflected in the coalition of groups that mobilized and conducted follow-up advocacy at the Human Rights Council and the continued efforts towards the GA resolution. As has already been underscored, there's a substantial majority of states that have already recognized in some way the right to a healthy environment. Within this context, we expect there to be other positive developments to reaffirming recognition, both across the UN system and for civil society, similar to which we're seeing following the 2010 General Assembly resolution recognizing the right to water and sanitation. This was also mentioned a bit earlier. Full recognition at the UN will serve to standardize and lift national ambitions and norms and support the monitoring and enforcement of laws. Recognition will also provide for more coherence throughout the UN system, including the systematization of the right as was just framed in terms of the normative cascade. In the past number of years, we have seen this via the work of the former and current special rapporteurs, John Knox and David Boyd, to the Secretary General's call to action and common agenda report, amongst other work and across spaces. As was noted this morning by the Assistant Secretary General, however, there are still states that hesitate and speak against recognition of the right in various spaces. So even with these hesitations, we nonetheless see the process of integration continuing and expanding with the inclusion of the right in various texts. John and David today mentioned the importance of general comments and just kind of highlighting also that the CEDAW in their latest draft of the general recommendation on Indigenous women and girls recognize the right to a healthy environment. For us, an important example, and for that of our partners in relation to business and human rights, is the third draft of the legally binding instrument to regulate transnational corporations under human rights law, which defined the scope of human rights abuse to include the right to a healthy environment. A GA resolution will serve to ensure that UN bodies, experts, and member states understand the right to be central and interlinked with issues concerning not only other human rights, but development and security. Likewise, reaffirming recognition and integration of the right will positively impact how we as civil society interact with and conduct advocacy towards the UN and its bodies, as well as at the national level. Crucially, and I think it's important to reiterate, as it was said again this morning in the two panels, it will also reaffirm and provide widespread support for the legitimate calls of human rights defenders. These are our colleagues, our partners, and our friends. One recent study by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center noted that of the hundreds of cases of attacks documented in 2021 against human rights defenders who raised concerns against business-related human rights abuses, 70% were against climate, land, and environmental rights defenders. Broader consensus and reaffirming recognition of the right to a healthy environment should support the prevention of such violations as well as strengthen protection mechanisms. Moreover, reaffirming recognition should not only increase business respect for environmental HRDs, but also further encourage business consultations with them. Similarly, businesses would be compelled to include and incorporate the right to a healthy environment into their human rights due diligence processes, including environmental assessments. And as a final point, even though we're all gathered here today, moving towards a new normal, and while the pandemic persists, I think it's especially important to recall that in the first few months and year of the pandemic, we continue to hear and see how COVID exacerbated already present inequalities. This included disparities related to access to water and sanitation, to evidence of higher rates of morbidity from COVID for individuals predominantly in minority and marginalized communities as a result of prior exposure to air pollution. 2 years on, we not only see little being done to address these issues, we also see retrogressive measures. Reaffirming the right to a healthy environment will hopefully serve to begin to address these systemic inequalities in a holistic manner and help fulfill the call of the UN and others to build forward better. So we call on all states to seize this historic opportunity to support the core group towards a General Assembly resolution and to then take all possible measures to ensure its implementation. Finally, as a member of civil society, we also call on all of those that are here and watching to join our social media campaign that's happening now, calling on New York missions with the support of capitals to move forward with a GA resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. I'd just like to highlight a couple of things she said. The first one is something that Cesar also mentioned, and that is that this is bottom up. And the truth is we wouldn't have any human rights and we wouldn't have any environmental protection if it weren't for civil society and the pressures that civil society have brought over the years. So this is very consistent with that. The second point is I think she's the first person to mention these SLAP suits and businesses' roles, very important. The third is the environmental impact assessments. I think we'll see changes in those now and more attention to human rights and more attention to the human right to a healthy environment as that goes forward. One of the startling things that John Knox's mapping exercise detailed or revealed really was that there's a human rights obligation to do environmental impact assessments. It was true across the board in all the 14 segments of the human rights system that he mapped. And nobody realized that before John had found this out. And of course, the international law, the Court of International Justice, I should say, has held that there's a customary international law requirement to provide or to conduct an environmental impact assessment in the transboundary situation. So this right should find itself expressed there. And finally, I love your phrase. Well, I shouldn't say finally. Emphasizing the questions of inequalities and inequities is extremely important. And we all think that this right will help in that way. And finally, I love your phrase, to build forward better. It's not to build back better. It all seemed to me we're looking backwards here. We should be looking forward sustainably. And thank you for putting it that way. Samia?
Thanks all for having me here today. I'm very elated to be able to reiterate a lot of what was already said. But I want to start by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is Lenape Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people. and by thanking each of you for joining us here today. As member states, environmental human rights defenders, NGOs, and UN agencies, your presence reflects the consensus for an interest in recognition of the human right to a healthy environment. With April being Earth Month and with Earth Day quickly approaching, naturally, we can appreciate this opportunity to discuss the human right to a healthy environment. So I want to start with me living here in New York City. We had 3 heat waves in 2021, and that summer was above the yearly average for days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. Over the past decade, Black New Yorkers have been found to be twice as likely to die from severe heat than other groups. On a national level, the Environmental Protection Agency released a report in 2021 on the risks of climate change for Black Americans. And among other things, it found that with 2 degrees Celsius of warming, Black people are 40% more likely than non-Black people to currently live in areas with the highest projected increases in extreme temperature-related deaths. Black children are 34% more likely than non-Black children to currently live in areas with the highest projected increases in childhood asthma diagnoses with 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And Black people are 41% more likely than non-Black people with 2 degrees Celsius of warming to currently live in areas with the highest projected premature deaths for those 65 and older due to air pollution. The convergence of racial and social inequalities with the disproportionate burdens of the climate emergency here in the US is just one example of the global ramifications of a failure to protect the environmental rights of our human family. The reality we currently experience has been shaped by many forces, some of the worst being the violence and destruction of war, colonialism and its resulting generational trauma, unfettered extractivism, and economic systems hardwired to focus on GDP. Each of these ailments has engendered a detrimental disregard for environmental health and a resulting indifference to human health and well-being. This is why I believe there's something fundamentally affirming to the self by declaring that we have a human right to a healthy environment. The right to a healthy environment is that right upon which all others rest. Human dignity, the ability to live freely, to live healthfully, and with adequate sanitation, to support oneself, to self-determination, to bring children into the world, to be free of discrimination, and the list goes on. It is the unspoken assumption that underlies the concepts of environmental justice and climate justice for vulnerable and disenfranchised communities. It is vocalization of this assumption by universal recognition of the right to a healthy environment that can help effectuate remedies and reparations for past and current wrongs, and that can foster a more just and equitable society for us all. I envision recognition of the human right to a healthy environment to more deeply entrench the existing human rights of all people, to improve available legal remedies, and to spur appropriate governance mechanisms and unparalleled international cooperation in good faith to address the interlinked challenges we face today. As to existing rights, a resolution acknowledging the right to a healthy environment will protect the poorest of the poorest who presently face and continue to face acute food and water insecurity, frighteningly so under worsening climate conditions as expressed in the latest IPCC report. For Indigenous peoples, recognition of this right at the General Assembly would represent first and foremost commitment to eradicating the cruelty and violence that Indigenous land and water defenders have suffered and continue to endure while putting their lives on the line to save our planet. Recognition would also demonstrate the commitment of member states to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, including the ability to pass on their cultural and linguistic inheritances, to preserve their place-based relationships with the land and other relatives, and to enjoy traditional diets. For children and youth, especially for those in the global South and marginalized in the global North, the right to a healthy environment would protect our ability to benefit from and enjoy an environment conducive to living, learning, and playing, and pursuing dreams and ambitions. It would also relieve many youth of a sense of doom and climate anxiety and allow them to grow and develop more healthily without threat of future conflicts due to the impacts of climate change. For women, girls, and gender non-conforming people, recognition of the right to a healthy environment can disrupt power imbalances that place them in subordinate positions, often subjected to inadequate natural resources and violence, and therefore lesser social mobility and access to information. As to legal remedies, the right to a healthy environment would effectuate the rights of individuals to have access to procedural justice for any violations, like purposeful or systematic exclusion from access to environmental benefits and services, and unfair exposure to environmental harms like pollution or flooding. It would also provide avenues for individuals and communities to assert that their relationships with ecosystems are to be recognized. Plus, it would support the right to participation of concerned groups in decision-making processes affecting their environments. And finally, as to international cooperation, recognition of the right to a healthy environment would signify that climate action can be streamlined and multilaterally reinforced to achieve a net zero emissions and ultimately climate positive reality guided by the Paris Agreement. With a consensus for maintaining a healthy climate, governments, businesses, civil society, academics, and communities can work together to halt the crisis to the very best of our abilities. This will further justify robust provisions for mitigation, adaptation, climate finance, technical support, and redress for loss and damage, especially for states already facing devastating impacts of the climate emergency. And this would cause a galvanizing force for ongoing indigenous land stewardship initiatives and conservation efforts to address biodiversity loss across our lands and oceans. Looking to the future of development on Earth, recognition of the right to a healthy environment will elevate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and other conventions, lay out a strong foundation for a just transition into renewable energy economies, and support a just transition from the COVID-19 pandemic. This right will ensure that the improvement of material conditions, industry, and innovation work hand in hand in a way that protects the rights of people today while guaranteeing the rights of people to come. The right to a healthy environment denotes a need for regenerative care for the earth and thereby secures the prosperity and resilience of individuals, society, and all other living things. Recognition of the right to a healthy environment at the General Assembly would also hail the beginning of a new era for humankind on Earth. It would represent the ushering in of a world in which science, indigenous knowledge, cooperation, innovation, reciprocity, faith, and justice are the foundation of our status quo. Recognizing the human right to a healthy environment would mean that we will no longer silo environmental issues from climate issues or gender issues or income inequality issues or disability issues, but instead that we will view our challenges from a systems lens. The Human Rights Council resolution has shown the global momentum that brings us here today. We have the tools and the knowledge to assure that each and every person is entitled to living in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, free of toxic waste and free of inequitable exclusion from natural resources and ecosystem services. We have an overwhelming awareness that our opportunity to secure a healthy and safe climate and to cease the cascade of irreversible impacts on our fragile system is temporary. We have a duty to heed the calls of children, youth, indigenous peoples, and women. We have the unique and fleeting opportunity to cultivate a different and better state of being for humankind and the planet for eons to come. Let's not waste this moment. Let's be too late.
Remarkable. Thank you very much, Samia. First, thank you for reminding us about the Native American heritage here and that history. It's important to keep that in mind. I have a place on an island near where David lives, and every year the Native American tribes of that area come around and camp with us for a night, and we feed them, and they remind us that we're on their territory. So this is very important, and thank you for that. The emphasis on environmental justice here, the way you put that was very important. You recall she said the unspoken assumption that the basis for environmental justice is the right to a healthy environment. That is so accurate. Environmental justice requires no disproportionate impact. Everyone knows that. Of course, it happens all the time, but we know that's part of it. We know it requires equal opportunity and meaningful opportunity to participate. No one argues about that. The EPA refuses to acknowledge it also requires equal access to environmental amenities like clean water, parks, that sort of thing, sanitation. But it also requires a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. You could have the first three, and there would be no justice if we were being poisoned by our environment. And that's often not said. And so it's very important that you underline that. And thank you for that. Your emphasis or your reference to climate anxiety is very important. But your whole message, and I think the message of all of our speakers today, is that every person counts, every person's actions count. Individuals can make a huge difference, and there is a possibility for, as you put it, a regenerative and positive future. So I want to just emphasize those things. Now, I have a couple of questions here. We only have roughly 20 minutes to take questions before the final panel. But are there any from the floor? And I'd like you to keep your question to 1 minute if you have any. No, yes. Please identify yourself and then ask your question. I don't know if there's a microphone. I hope there is.
Hi, hi, this is Judel Harthi from the United Nations. My question is on the normative cascade, which you mentioned how some of the major challenges are fragmentation, right, and uncertainty. And so I'm just wondering, what is your assessment in terms of fragmentation on the international community now that the resolution is here? We're seeing that, and we have seen even in the past the amount of initiatives, programs. This is maybe a historical resolution, but we've said it repeatedly today that we've been working on this issue for years and years. And so what is your assessment in terms of the fragmentation of the international community? And you've mentioned some great solutions to tackling those challenges, but if we can take it to more of a global lens, then what are their tools to address this fragmentation globally?
Thank you. So did everyone hear that? Everyone all right? Cesar, I think that was addressed to you. So do you want to take a shot at it? Then I'll ask these other questions unless there are other questions from the floor.
Sure. Thanks for the questions. Very quickly. There is a lot of activity being taking place at the domestic and even the regional level. Maria Antonia mentioned, for example, the 2017 advisory opinion from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on the right to a healthy environment, which is a very good example of what can happen when there is what international law scholars call orchestration at the international level. So you don't need to have some world authority adjudicating on the right to a healthy environment on each case, right? What you need is some focal points, some normative understanding that then can be applied, replicated at the domestic level. That advisory opinion has been quoted extensively by domestic courts. True, in Latin America, that judicial and normative dialogue is quite fluid because of historical and linguistic reasons, but I don't see why it couldn't happen also at the global level. So again, this is a matter of scaling up. For that to happen, though, you really do need an authoritative pronouncement, and this is why the details of the potential resolution do matter, and it does matter to scale it up from the Council to the General Assembly. And then the mechanisms are quite diverse. So I'll just give you a couple of examples by way of illustration. I mentioned one, which is the cooperation and cross-learning among governments and judges. So there are all kinds of professional associations, coordination mechanisms at the global level. The judges, last year, some of us participated online or in person in a global meeting put together by judges working on environmental law issues. It was fantastic. It was a 3-day event in Rio de Janeiro. and so some of us were not lucky enough to make it there, but we participated online. And there was a truly global dialogue about what it meant to implement not just the right to a healthy environment, but other standards. And finally, I would mention more informal forms of cross-learning and communication that happen through professional networks, like academic networks, the setting up of repositories of either handbooks or judicial decisions, all of which expedite the dissemination of knowledge. But that's all happening already. But in the absence of a global authoritative pronouncement and standard, it all gets it's slowed down. And so this is why when I talked about the normative cascade, I also mentioned that it would contribute to scaling up and speeding up this process of implementation of the right to healthy environment.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions here. Two of them are related to Maria. Are civil society as mobilized for the General Assembly resolution as they were for the Human Rights Council consideration? And second, are these plans, or are there plans for the coming weeks and months?
Thank you. I do think that we are as mobilized. I am the New York representative. Our headquarters is in Geneva. So my colleagues there were working on the resolution, and there were numerous partners in Geneva that were conducting advocacy, many of them that also have offices here in New York. So there was this period of transition following the Human Rights Council resolution in the fall to individuals that were based in New York with the same organizations and with other organizations. Kristen is here, that's been working on it this entire period. We had continued support from John and David as well. And also we had close coordination and support with the core group in Geneva, and now here in New York also with Costa Rica. So I think that there is still strong coordination and mobilization, and I think it definitely helped here that there was already this, not just a recognition, but kind of all of the steps and processes that happened in Geneva were followed up on here to see what worked, what didn't work. Obviously, it's a different context here in New York. And I'm sorry, the second question is in the next few weeks and months. We're continuing to organize. We meet weekly. We're, as was said in the first panel, we're looking forward to hearing the timetable by Costa Rica, hopefully today, and the core group. And I think that would really help in terms of setting our schedule for moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah, no pressure. The future of the world only depends on this, so don't relax. And the next question is for Samia, and in that it is it consistent for the U.S. government to promote environmental justice? And as you probably know, both on the first day of his inauguration and a couple of days later, President Biden issued very strong executive orders regarding and in favor of promoting environmental justice. Is that consistent with opposing the right to a healthy environment? Samia?
I think the obvious answer is no, it's not. I think that there's definitely an opportunity for the US to take on environmental justice and climate justice as it purports it will do. I think these executive orders have definitely been helpful in mobilizing federal agencies and other activities to streamline funding and resources into environmental justice. But we've had an Office of Environmental Justice and for a while now. And I think fundamentally the definitions of what environmental justice is, what it consists of, what it requires, needs revision, especially in the US context. And I think that a recognition and support of the human right to a healthy environment would connote an interest in preserving environmental justice and supporting it. But I think as it stands right now, the answer would be no.
No. Good, thank you very much. There's another question for Cesar here. What would be the benefits of integrating the right to a healthy environment into the global biodiversity framework and other international environmental and climate agreements?
I'm glad that that question came up because this has to do with the harmonization of different legal regimes. And that's where fragmentation also impedes, prevents a greater impact. Because the right to a healthy environment cuts across different subfields, climate, biodiversity, pollution, it really does provide kind of a common platform. And the implications of the right to a healthy environment for biodiversity or climate are already being extracted by specialists, by treaty bodies, but having a firm ground to sort out the implications of a general right to a healthy environment for, say, the protection of biodiversity on the country and biodiversity laws is crucial. I'll just mention one specific example because we're doing with David, with our academic hats, a study on rights-based biodiversity litigation. And we found in doing kind of scoping for that type of litigation around the world, we found that both litigators and courts have been very busy already setting up the standards and clarifying the standards. One type of case that comes up very frequently, for instance, is the protection of key ecosystems for individual and communal life, mangroves, forests, coastal areas, oceans. And the recognition of the right to a healthy environment, this has happened above all at the level of the domestic courts because of the existence, availability of constitutional norms and legislation, both on the right to a healthy environment and the biodiversity in countries like the Philippines or Costa Rica or Colombia or India and elsewhere. What I see happening if the GA endorses the right to a healthy environment is the further kind of that movement gaining momentum and providing a common language and a common ground upon which courts, governments, and civil society actors and even businesses can also gain momentum in terms of protection of biodiversity and also, of course, climate action.
Thank you. This is a question for Samia and Mario. I'll let you decide which order you want to take it. Would you talk about the relationship between the right to a healthy environment and the rights of future generations? And this is from Stephen in the UK.
Oh, sure. I think certainly the right to a healthy environment is a prerequisite, like we were reinforcing earlier, for the rights of future generations to exist, to have a suitable kind of existence on the planet Earth. I think definitely it creates standards, as we've been mentioning, to allow future generations to inhabit. So what does that mean? I guess in terms of what a healthy environment consists of, what a safe climate is, what clean water is. And I think it just lays out, you could say, guidelines for how we occupy our time now and what we leave in terms of natural resources, ecosystem services, in terms of burdens for the people that come after us. And I especially think that is of interest to young people, to children, and to people who bear children.
Yeah, I guess just very briefly and following up on that, the same in terms of one of the descriptives of sustainable, to make sure that it is a healthy, clean environment for future generations. And I think also a recognition of the right will hopefully spur states to take really effective actions for remediation. So we've had, as FI, worked on some cases where there is this issue of intergenerational harm, where maybe some of the effects aren't visible immediately, but they do come up. So I think that there is this point of continuing to make sure that due diligence processes and other processes occur very early on and in line with the right to a healthy environment, so that future generations also don't suffer from those impacts, whether they're immediately visible or not.
Yeah, thank you. Two things I would note. First is, in a way, we don't have to talk about future generations. I have a 1-year-old granddaughter. She'll be alive, hopefully, at the turn of the century. And you notice that most of the projections, they stop at the turn of the century. Right? We'll have 3.2 degrees centigrade by the turn of the century, or we're trying to have 2 or 1.5. What about after that? I mean, it's a very limited perspective that our narrative, our dialogue is occurring in. And so this aspect is really not caught as much as it might be. Okay, Cesar, there are 2 questions here. How can we clarify the scope and content of the universal right to a healthy environment? And as a sub-question, just to pique your interest, can we say that climate change or pollution, toxification prevents a violation of the right?
Prevents information.
Presents.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay. So the first, this is going to be easy because the on answer those are key questions. I think the answers are available. The scope and the content has been clarified by the not only by courts but importantly at the UN level by the work of the rapporteurs. We have them both here, and again the mapping report, the frameworks, the framework principles, the specific reports on climate biodiversity that David has produced. I think that that's it's an embarrassment of riches in terms of very specific guidance as to how to implement the right to a healthy environment and what it means. And again, this is why I said earlier that if we didn't have those reports, we would need to produce them. Like this is what everyone should be doing now, but please don't do it. The lawyers and especially in human rights advocates, we have a thing for reinventing the wheel. So that's already being done. I think that the big challenge is implementation, right? Of course, the challenge for governments, I'm hoping that the governments will do their part by recognizing the right at the level of the GA. The challenge for everyone else, as soon as hopefully that right is recognized, is to work on implementation immediately and not waste time relitigating the efforts that have been already done. And then on climate, yes, the answer would be yes, and in fact, both in the reports that I just mentioned and in the hundreds and hundreds of laws and on biodiversity, pollution, climate, and also lawsuits, we have very specific illustrations as to how the worsening pollution and climate and biodiversity crisis are a direct affront to the right to a healthy environment.
Well, thank you very much. We only have a bit left. We have to, as I said, we have a hard stop at noon. So I'm going to give each of the panelists a minute or two to make some final comments, and then we'll draw to a close here. Maria, may I start with you?
Sure. I think a lot of what has been said today has been said across panels, and obviously there's a lot of commonality across these different spaces that we represent in terms of why we feel the right needs to be reaffirmed at the General Assembly. So for all of the states that are in the room, I would just ask for support of the core group, including possibly by co-sponsorship, and for other individuals to make sure that they're conducting advocacy towards their capitals and making their voices heard. So thank you.
It's an extremely important message. Maybe we should stop there, but we won't. Samia, would you like to?
I just want to say thank you for having me here. I did not expect to be so emotional about it, but I care, clearly. And I would just ask that we do our best. I think that's what we're left with. I think we have the tools, as I mentioned. I think we are amply aware. And at this point, if we were to ignore this, when we talk about in law mens rea, I think it would turn into purpose. So I just ask that we take this opportunity at the General Assembly, that we work together and cooperate to get this done. And as was already mentioned, it's okay if some people are left behind right now, because they will catch up and history will look at them in the appropriate ways that needs to be done. So thanks.
Thank you, Samia and Cesar.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what I said in response to the last round of questions. assuming and hoping that the recognition will happen at the level of the GA, my plea would be for fellow scholars and advocates to work collaboratively on implementation. That's a huge, huge challenge. The temptation would be to immediately jump to the next step. So do we want a binding treaty immediately after that? Like that, and that's plagued other fields like business and human rights in a very fractious way. My hope is that we would put our minds and heart together to make this a reality, and that we acknowledge that the time is running out and we can act accordingly.
Well, thank you very much. Could you please all join me in thanking our panelists? Housekeeping, I would hope, and we would all hope, that you would put your details on our guest list here on the list of participants. Even if you don't want to be active yourself, it's probably useful for you to continue to be informed of what's happening, and we hope that you will be active. The time is now, and we need action now over the next couple months to put pressures on governments and remind them of the importance of this moment in history. So they're down here. Now I'm going to say this panel is at an end. I want to say I come away from these always humbled by how incredible some other people in the world are. And this is a panel that did that in triplicate. So thank you again. We'll now call up David Boyd for the final panel. Again, we have a hard stop at noon. And we'll also hear from Costa Rica. Yeah, I think that's right. But Mark, how do we include Costa Rica? Are they here?
Yeah, they're at the front too.
Oh, they made it. Good. That's good. No, the reference to vaccinations had me worried. Would you like to come up and Carrazzo? Ambassador? Yes, I know. So I have to issue my apologies to the government of Costa Rica for not recognizing their presence throughout. I will say he was very attentive. I was afraid he was from some antagonistic force. But may we turn to you, sir? Thank you very much for coming, and we greatly appreciate, I can't even say how much we appreciate your efforts over the years on this set of issues. It's been truly inspirational.
Thank you. And yes, we've been attentive throughout the morning and appreciative to all the cooperation and the light that has been shed into this matter, which is in our hands. Yes, now at the General Assembly. And as you, Dan, I come humbled of how much people know about this and how much people have worked on this subject throughout the years. And I am in the last stage of a diplomatic period in which every word has to be measured and consented by several people before them being aired. This is a very, very important a process in which we are. It is what delicate. I would say if we are to achieve a result that is appropriate, that is timely, and that is that comprises what we need. So the consensus words are here for Daniel to read because he's the one has been negotiating them with our fellow members of the core group. Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Embajador Carazo, and thank you very much to all of you. I would like to start to acknowledge the presence of the members of the core group, of my fellow colleagues. So Spela from Slovenia, Noemi from Switzerland, Hassan, the Maldives, Majda from Morocco, who's joining us virtually. I appreciate your presence a lot, and I am here as the deliverer of this message, of this collective message from the core group. So thank you very much. We would like to thank, of course, the organizers of this seminar, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Mr. David Boyd, the Universal Rights Group, New York University, of course, the United Nations Environmental Program, and in addition with multiple co-sponsors for organizing this important expert seminar to raise momentum on a matter that is very, very dear for us indeed. So I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, Switzerland, and my own country, Costa Rica. Together, we support the universal recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Our countries, members of the core group on human rights and the environment, promoted the recognition by the Human Rights Council through Resolution 48/13 of the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, gaining also the support of more than 70 member states co-sponsors. This recognition represents an international milestone for environmental and human rights law that adds to the already existing legal basis at national and regional levels of this right. The right is also rooted in the 1972, as many of the speakers have mentioned before, 1972 Stockholm Declaration, and more than 155 member states have recognized some form of the right to a healthy environment, either in international agreements, their national constitutions, environmental legislations, or policies. In addition to this recognition, the Human Rights Council resolution encourages member states to adopt policies for the enjoyment of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as appropriate, including with respect to biodiversity and ecosystems. Moreover, the resolution invites the General Assembly to consider the matter. Our countries believe in this regard that the adoption of a UN General Assembly resolution reaffirming this recognition is key to increase priority for environmental protection and climate action, as the last reports of the IPCC and the UN Secretary General's report on our common agenda urge us to do. It is our shared view that the universal recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment complements other recommendations in the OCA, our Common Agenda report, as well as builds on our commitments in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and other instruments related to protecting the planet, climate action, and delivering for future generations. We consider, therefore, this recognition timely and of utmost importance as it is related to other rights and existing international law. As a matter of fact, the core group has already launched the preparations of this process internally within the core group and is ready to engage in open, inclusive, and transparent consultations in the coming months this year. Engaging in inclusive and open consultations with all stakeholders, including the private sector and the pertinent civil society, is also vital to achieve the right outcome and delivering on the promise together. So we invite member states to support this initiative, convinced that this be the culmination of a long history and legal basis, as we have learned today, on the elaboration of this right, but will additionally represent both a message of hope for present and future generations and spur ambition and action in a critical juncture such as this one. So I thank you very much for listening to us.
Yes. Mr. Ambassador?
Thank you. In 1994, it has been mentioned, our constitution in Costa Rica was modified in order to incorporate Article 50, second paragraph in Article 50 of the Constitution, which precisely consecrates the right of a healthy and balanced environment for all. So in the last, what is it, 28 years, I've been a witness of what it has meant for our country, for our population, for the work of our courts, for the legislation, for the normatives, and for policies. It's been a wonder. I mean, it's been such an advancement in the way in which Costa Rica behaves towards its citizens by protecting the environment, just not only because of this mandate, but because of the general perception of the whole country about the issue. And therefore, we again are humbled by the so many mentions to Costa Rica this morning. But we have to try better. We have to try better. There's still things to do there, and we have the guidelines and the decision, the engagement to have them done and to participate with the other core group members, with the countries that were that participated in the enactment at the Human Rights Council, and hopefully a large majority of countries voting for the resolution in the very near future. That is our hope.
Thank you. Thank you again, not only to Costa Rica, but to the whole core group that over the years has really pushed this issue and explicated it and consulted very transparently, taken all issues, all concerns, all thoughts into account. And that's very important in this process. David?
How long do I have, Dan?
You have 7 minutes.
I don't need 7 minutes. I'd like to start off by thanking the organizers. It's a lot of work to put these events together, so thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Costa Rica, the Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland for their extraordinary leadership and service to humanity, I would say, in terms of bringing this resolution forward to the Human Rights Council last fall. And I would say only in response to the statement from the core group today that we've had a number of really powerful speeches today, and I think that the Secretary General himself has described the IPCC reports as code red for humanity. I feel like, to me, I'm somewhat overcome as well. This is an emergency situation, and we don't have time to wait. In an emergency, we don't dawdle, we don't dither around, we take action. If the house is on fire, we phone the fire department, they bring the engines, they spray the water on the fire. We're not treating the global planetary emergency with the degree of urgency that it so desperately requires. And I think that the General Assembly, as kind of one of the leading institutions of humanity, really has an opportunity here to show that they're taking this crisis seriously, respecting the fact that it is an emergency, respecting the fact that life on Earth, as we know it, is really at stake. And so, I mean, I have a 16-year-old daughter who she suffers from climate anxiety. And she says to me when I come to these meetings, well, why is it taking so long, Papa? Like, obviously, we have a planetary crisis. Why is the UN so slow to act? And why are you failing to move them along? And so I think that really, I want to echo what Samia said. I want to echo what Adriana Salazar said on that beautiful video, that the time to act is now. And I'm sure all of the people in this room will use all of the energy and the skills that we have to support the core group in making this happen, not in the months ahead, but in the weeks ahead. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here. I just want to reiterate, there is no reason not to move forward. There's no excuse for not moving forward. I've been a diplomat as well. Now is the time, and all of you can help. And this is a moment in history. You'll look back and say, did I participate? Did I help? Or did I not? And I'm not joking about that. That's not hyperbole. Thank you very much. And I'll declare this seminar over. Thank you, Ambassador.
Yes.